Hello, we're doing Laws of Purim, and we are on Tafresh Pei Tes, which is 689, number 2, and we're learning about reading the Megillah. Beis, number 2. Echad hakori ve'echad hashamea min hakori yatsi yedei chavaso. Whether you read the Megillah yourself or hear from somebody who reads the Megillah, you fulfill your obligation. So you don't actually have to read it, you can go to synagogue and listen to someone who's reading it. V'hu sheyishma mishehu chayav b'kiryasa, but you have to listen from somebody who is also required to read the Megillah. Meaning, let's say somebody who's not Jewish reads the Megillah, you wouldn't fulfill your obligation because only Jewish people are required to read the Megillah. So even though this non-Jewish person can read the Megillah, one does not fulfill his obligation. And the Mechaber continues, Lefikach, therefore, Im haya korech heirish katan ashotem, if the person reading is deaf, or a child, or he is mentally disabled, or a shota, which is it's not necessarily what we would colloquially call someone who's mentally disabled, but it's a very specific mental illness. So a deaf person, someone with a specific type of mental illness, and a child, hashomea mimenu lo yatsa. Someone who listens from them does not fulfill his obligation. The reason is because these people are not required to listen to the Megillah. They are exempt. And even though we said children are required, we're going to discuss exactly what that means, and we're also going to discuss what type of deaf person we're talking about. There are those that say that women do not exempt men, and we'll talk about that soon. There are those that say there are those that say that a woman who reads the Megillah for herself, the blessing she makes is lishmoa, to listen to the Megillah, because there are really two mitzvahs in the Megillah. There's a mitzvah to read it, and there's a mitzvah to hear it. So women only have one of the mitzvahs. Some say the mitzvah of listening to the Megillah, not a mitzvah of reading it. Okay, let's see the Mishnah Berurah. Yatzei yedei chavasa v'tzara sheyichaven hakori lahotzi v'hashamei latzes kedin shari mitzvos she'achad motzi chaveru uked lakaman v'simen tafresh ayin aleph. The person reading the Megillah should have in mind that he is fulfilling the mitzvah for everyone listening, and the people listening should have in mind that they are fulfilling the mitzvah through the person reading. Just like all other mitzvahs that we do like that. Cheirish, someone who's deaf. Hainu hamedaber ve'enu shomea klal. Here we're talking about a deaf person, somebody who can speak. Obviously he can speak because he's reading the Megillah, but he can't hear at all. Now usually we hold, when you read the Megillah, or when you daven, let's say, do you have to hear the words that you're saying to fulfill the obligation? Right? If you whisper so softly that you can't hear, do you fulfill the obligation? So usually we say that somebody who does not hear, does not say it loud enough to hear, he still fulfills the obligation. So how come here, a deaf person, who obviously can't hear himself, read the Megillah, why doesn't he fulfill the obligation? Since the Megillah has an aspect of publicizing the mitzvah, we are more stringent than by other things. So here by Megillah, a person would have to read it loud enough so they can hear it. And it's required, what we said, alternatively, or it could be that someone who's deaf is halachically different, because if somebody who can hear just doesn't say it loud enough for it to reach his ears, he fulfills obligation. But a cheirish, someone who's deaf, can never hear. So that type of person is not able to fulfill the mitzvah to exempt others. And we're only talking about here someone who can't hear at all. Coming to exclude somebody who's hard of hearing, that if you speak to him very loudly, he can hear. We're not talking about such a person. Now all of this is according to the Shulchan Aruch. Some hold that actually a total deaf person, someone who's totally deaf and can't hear at all, they could exempt others for the mitzvah. But everyone agrees that lechatchila, initially, the preferred practice should not be to have a deaf person exempt everyone else. Someone who is hard of hearing, let's say, he should either, or he's very far away from the Megillah and he can't hear the Megillah, so you should read the Megillah to himself. Right? If you're very in the back of the shul and you can't hear, even if you're not hard of hearing, you don't fulfill the mitzvah. Or if you're hard of hearing and you can't hear the Megillah, you don't fulfill the mitzvah. So what do? You should read it to yourself. Or what you can do is you can have a chumash with you, and if there are words that you missed, you could read those words right away from the chumash. O katan, we said also a child should not read the Megillah for everybody else. Right, so labbe the etzem kriyas ha Megillah have rak midivrei seifrim v'chiv shel katan have gam kein rak midrabanan b'chol mitzvos ma she'en kein gadol have chad rabbanan v'lo asi trei rabbanan umapik chad rabbanan. So he asks a question. He says that a child, we mentioned, is required to hear the Megillah rabbinically. There's a mitzvah to educate a child. Even though he's not 13, he or she is not 12 or 13 yet, nevertheless, there's a mitzvah for a child rabbinically to hear the Megillah. He asks a question that everybody's obligation to hear the Megillah is rabbinic, right? The Megillah doesn't appear in the Torah. It happened much after the story of Purim. So their obligation to hear the Megillah is only rabbinic. And usually the rule is that if you have the same level of obligation, you can exempt another person. So if adults are required to hear the Megillah rabbinically, and children are required to hear the Megillah rabbinically, how come a child can't read for an adult? So the Mishnah Berurah answers is because since a child is worse, since every mitzvah that a child has is only rabbinic, whereas an adult, it's this particular mitzvah which is rabbinic. But since the child has every single mitzvah he has, right, to hear the shofar, which is a Torah mitzvah, the obligation on a child is only rabbinic because it is because of chinuch, to educate the child, but he doesn't have an actual Torah mitzvah, so his obligation is weaker even though they are both rabbinic. But in even the Shulchan Aruch brings that some say a child could read the Megillah, just like he can light Hanukkah candles for others. So he says, the Mishnah Berurah, that according to this opinion, or he says if you have a case where no adults in the community can read the Megillah, then you could have a child to read the Megillah. But the initial practice is that a child should not read the Megillah. So we learned here that lechatchila, someone who is totally deaf, and a child should not read the Megillah for anybody else. And tomorrow, next time, whenever we meet again, virtually, we'll talk about women. Can a woman read the Megillah for men? Can she read the Megillah for herself, for others? We will talk more about that, Bli Neder, next time. Have a great evening.